Welcome to this CRA special of the IoT Security Foundation monthly webinar series. My name is Chris, and I'm delighted to say that our 2026 conference has now been announced. TechWorks is the parent organisation of the IoTSF, and to mark its 30th anniversary, it's holding one big London event on Wednesday, the 26th of August at the Novotel West in Hammersmith. The IoT Security Foundation 2026 conference will be a part of this massive event with its own auditorium, and this landmark summit will span semiconductor design, semiconductor manufacturing, AI and automotive, and the networking will be unbeatable. We're expecting around 800 people to attend and 90 exhibitors, so this is not to be missed. For details, go to the IoT Security Foundation website and get yourself registered nice and early. So coming up soon, we'll have David Pashley of Direct Insight presenting CRA challenges for IoT devices. But first, it's Mustanir Ali of Element with CRA reporting obligations. If you have any questions, observations, or comments for what you're about to see from Mustanir, please put them in Zoom chat if you're watching today's broadcast live. Mustanir, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Chris. So, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this presentation where I will do a quick overview of the CRA reporting obligations. So, without further ado, we'll first of all start with a brief introduction to the CRA itself and what it is. Just to set the context, really. So the CRA is a piece of EU legislation. It's a new piece of EU legislation, effectively part of the CE marking regime of product compliance and conformity for the European market. The goal of the CRA is to improve the level of product cybersecurity in the EU, and all the requirements are focused on cybersecurity and cybersecurity of so-called products with digital elements, which is basically products that have software and communicate digitally, and that includes software itself. So the CRA is different to other CE marking legislation in a couple of key respects, actually. First of all, it doesn't just apply to products at the point they're placed on the market. It actually imposes requirements to cover the product lifecycle, including development process and ongoing support. And then topically for today, the major sort of difference between the CRA and other CE marking legislation is that it introduces these reporting obligations, where manufacturers have to report certain cybersecurity incidents to authorities. And these obligations even affect products which are on the market now and will extend sort of throughout the lifetime of the product. And we'll explain that in sort of the next slide. So the big ticket item today is, and especially if you're watching this live, is that these reporting obligations do come into effect on the 11th of September 2026, which is now less than 5 months away. The rest of the requirements of the CRA don't come in until 11th of December. But if you've been focusing on that 11th December 2027 deadline, you may have missed that the 11th of September this year is actually the more pressing deadline, I could say. So very quickly, just to place these reporting obligations in the wider set of requirements and obligations for manufacturers, I quite like this image, which sort of highlights sort of the compliance journey that a product with digital elements might go through. So it starts with design and development, and then the product is placed on the market following conformity assessment and declaration of conformity. And then throughout its support period, it's maintained. So vulnerabilities will be discovered, and they will be dealt with through software updates, security patches, etc. And at the end of the support period, in theory, that's the end of compliance normally. But under the CRA, there is this obligation to report actively exploited vulnerabilities and severe incidents. And these reporting obligations actually continue beyond the end of the maintenance or support period for the product. So it's quite a big sort of ask, actually, and quite a big obligation that might affect more products than you might initially realize, and sooner. So getting onto these reporting obligations themselves, and we'll focus first on actively exploited vulnerabilities, which is the first topic that the CRA talks about. And this is all in Article 14 of the CRA. So if you do have access to the actual text of the legislation, you can look that up. And this is my digest of that information. So from the 11th of September 2026, these obligations come into force. And basically it starts with when a manufacturer becomes aware of an actively exploited vulnerability, they have 24 hours to submit an early warning notification to ENISA, which is the European Cybersecurity Organization, and a CSIRT, or Computer Security Incident Response Team, which is a body established in, actually each EU member state has at least one CSIRT established in it, and that is the body to which the report is made. Then 72 hours after the actively exploited vulnerability is sort of, you're aware of that, then there is a requirement to submit an actual incident notification, which includes a bit more detail about the description of it, some corrective and mitigating measures, and the general nature of that exploit and what's happening. And then 14 days later, or within 14 days later, a final report should be submitted, which details things like the information on who is exploiting it, what are the available corrective measures, what is the impact of this vulnerability, and other such details that are useful for the authorities to understand what's gone on and how to address it. So these are quite tight timescales, and this is specifically for these actively exploited vulnerabilities. Now we'll talk about severe incidents, which is the other thing that has to be reported. And again, the reporting timeline starts from when the manufacturer becomes aware of this so-called severe incident. And then the timelines look very similar. You have 24 hours after becoming aware to submit that early warning notification. And then after 72 hours of becoming aware, then their more detailed sort of description should be submitted. And then this time you get a month to submit the final report, which includes, again, a description, root cause, details of mitigating measures. So again, still a reasonably tight time frame, actually. And this is the reporting obligations in a nutshell. Does raise a few questions, such as, what do we mean by an incident? And an incident, the CRA borrows the definition from another directive of regulation, NIS2, and it is basically described as an event that compromises or can compromise the availability, authenticity, integrity, confidentiality of basically data, networks, or information systems. What then makes this severe is that it can actually negatively affect, or is capable of negatively affecting, sensitive or important data or functions. I read sort of capable of as being you could read that as meaning something is exploitable, because not all incidents, not all vulnerabilities are necessarily exploitable in the particular implementation of a product with digital elements. But if it is capable, it is exploitable, then it becomes, you could consider it as severe. Likewise, if it is capable of leading to the introduction or execution of malicious code in the product or in the networks and things to which it connects, then again, it is considered as severe. So again, I would read capable as meaning exploitable, or actually, this is something that can lead to that outcome. And that sort of gives us a way of testing, is this severe or not? So just to illustrate that in a sort of example, we have here our hypothetical product with digital elements. And somewhere lurking inside, there is a vulnerability. As most products, all products arguably will have some form of vulnerability in there somewhere. Along comes a malicious actor who finds and exploits that vulnerability. And that happens, and then as a manufacturer, once you become aware of that, you then have to report it to ENISA and your local CSIRT, and we'll get onto that and who that might be a bit later as well. This part, I think, is quite straightforward. The other side of things is an incident might occur. And there are many ways that you might become aware of an incident as a manufacturer. So it might be from a third-party report that's made to you as a manufacturer. Somebody tells you, hey, I found something wrong with your product, a vulnerability in your product. It could be through internal analysis, or you're having periodic sort of pen testing or other security testing being done on your products. And through that, vulnerabilities are being identified, or potential vulnerabilities are being identified. Or there are various other things, and even in the regulation talks about other security related events, which I imagine could be things like maybe a misconfiguration or something happened that caused something to be investigated, and that had security related implications. So something's happened, an incident has occurred that as a manufacturer you become aware of. So a judgment needs to be made. Is this severe or not? And again, I think of severe based on the text of the CRA as meaning basically exploitable in the specific implementation of this product with digital elements. And if it is severe, then again, the reporting timelines and obligations as detailed in the previous slide take effect. This needs to be reported to ENISA and the CCERT and dealt with accordingly. If it's not severe, then there's no need to report it. And you can follow your normal vulnerability handling processes for dealing with when you become aware of potential vulnerabilities in your product. Which then raises the question, how do you submit reports? So this is now described in Article 16 of the CRA, which basically requires ENISA to establish a single reporting platform for this. The idea is that this will be imagined as a website or a platform with basically notification endpoints issued to each member state and CCERT, which then manufacturers can use to actually make their reports. The idea is that all the CCERTs and ENISA are using the same platform so that they can share information amongst themselves and between member states, so that, for example, if the product is available in multiple member states, then the other member states that are affected can be warned about it or can take note. And the reporting platform is expected to be online by the 11th of September 2026, which, for those of you who are paying attention, is the actual deadline. So as of today, if you're watching this live, the platform isn't actually live yet. So the latest information I have is that it is under testing, so it does exist, and the ENISA and the CCERTs are at the moment trying it out and seeing if it works. The promise is it will be available by the deadline. My suggestion is that we all need to be looking out for more information on this single reporting platform when it becomes available. The other thing as a manufacturer you probably need to know is which CCERT do you report incidents to, given that there is a CCERT in each, at least one CCERT in each member state with its own sort of notification endpoint, and the member states where your product with digital elements has been made available, because that's information that is part of your report that you make to the CCERT. So the best resource I can think of is there is a website called the CCERTs Network, which basically has information of each member state and which CCERT is active in that member state. And this is a good sort of starting point to sort of find out who is your local CCERT and how do you contact them. Now, in today's world, many manufacturers and organizations, of course, are maybe spanning multiple locations, and who your local CCERT is might not be as easy a question to answer as it might be for someone else. So if you're established in the EU, then the way it is determined who is your local CCERT starts off by saying that the location where you have your main establishment in the EU, where decisions related to cybersecurity of products are predominantly taken. So it's not your largest location, but it's effectively the one where the decisions are made around security. And wherever that is established, that's the member state to which you will submit these notifications and reports. If that can't be determined, then the main establishment is considered to be basically the member state where the manufacturer has the highest number of employees. So in this case, I've put a big factory in Spain to illustrate that fact. If you're not in the EU, then it becomes a bit trickier. And the CRA does give a number of options and a logic to sort of identify who do you report to, because the reporting obligation will still apply if you're placing products with digital elements on the EU market. So the simplest case is you have an authorized representative. So if you have an authorized representative in the EU, then the member state of that authorized representative is where the notifications are made. Of course, it's not mandatory to have an authorized representative, and many manufacturers won't have one. In which case, then it is the member state where the importer placing on the market the highest number of products is. So not necessarily the biggest importer, but the one doing the most placing on the market of products. Similarly, if it's not possible or not easy to determine who the importer is or who that importer is, then if it's clear that there's a distributor that is placing on the market the most products that are affected, then the member state of that distributor can be identified as the member state CSERT that the reports are made to. And failing that, if none of that is clear, then it's quite simply the member state where the highest number of users is. And that member state becomes the one to which the CSERT reports are made to. So it's clear that you're going to need to do some legwork to identify which CSERT are you going to make the reports to, especially if you're outside the EU. It might not be immediately clear. And it could potentially be different for different products as well, just to really sort of make things complicated. So I think the next 5 months may well be critical to sort of trying to understand some of this and how to make these reports. So often what happens is when we talk about these obligations for reporting that are coming into place, these get mixed up with another set of obligations in the CRA, which are the vulnerability handling obligations. So these are part of the actual security requirements of the CRA, and these don't actually come into effect until 11th of December 2027. So to be really clear, from 11th of September 2026 until 11th of December 2027, the only real obligation is to report vulnerabilities, exploited vulnerabilities and incidents. Strictly speaking, there isn't a legal requirement to do this stuff, which is actually deal with these reports. However, in practice, at least some of this ought to be in place or would aid with dealing with these vulnerabilities and incidents, especially around things like SBOM to help you identify and become aware of vulnerabilities, or indeed to deal with them because you don't want to be having unsecure or exploitable products out in the field. I always imagine or describe these requirements as sort of looking a lot like a customer complaint procedure. So if you haven't implemented a vulnerability handling process before, I think it looks a lot like receiving sort of complaints where you need to have a means of actually finding out that there are vulnerabilities or exploits, and that's the so-called preparation phase in the draft standard that's going to talk about vulnerability handling for the CRA. And then you have a means of actually receiving them, whether that's through a public link or a communication channel, or it's through internal tests and processes that you're doing to discover these vulnerabilities. Once you get notification or become aware of vulnerabilities from whichever channel, then the CRA doesn't talk about this, but a good idea is to actually verify the nature of these vulnerabilities. Is it exploitable? Because if it's not exploitable, then that changes perhaps what happens with these reporting obligations. It also changes the severity and the urgency to perhaps deal with these potential vulnerabilities. In any case, at some point, you'll be remediating or dealing with the vulnerability and then releasing a fix or some means of mitigating that vulnerability, whatever that may look like. And that's fundamentally the vulnerability handling process, which comes into place once you know about vulnerabilities. But again, just to stress and to conclude, that obligation comes in 11th of December 2027. 11th of September 2026, the main reporting obligation that comes into effect is that you have to report to ENISA or the CSIRTs as a manufacturer when you become aware of these actively exploited vulnerabilities or severe incidents. Everything else, 11th of December 2027. But of course, there's a lot of preparation that needs to go into being ready for that. And at this point is where I hand back to Chris and then over to David to tell us some more. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mustanir Ali. I'm just going to fiddle around with the cameras. Normally I've got somebody in the background doing this for me, but not today. You just can't get the staff anymore. Mustanir, expert knowledge, cogent, eloquent. Is anybody watching this webinar today like Mustanir? If you are, I will be announcing the call for papers for the 2026 IoTSF conference imminently in the next few days, in fact, so look out for that. I did mention details of our 2026 conference at the top of this broadcast. I'll be repeating them very soon. Next month's IoT Security Foundation webinar will take place on Thursday, the 28th of May, and we'll be talking about 303.645 with Ken Munro and Sam Tom of Pentest Partners. If you'd like to register nice and early, go to the events section of our website, which is iotsecurityfoundation.org, and you'll get an email reminder closer to the time. If you're watching live today, the link to register for next month's webinar is in Zoom chat right now. Click on that, open it up in a new tab. Up next, it's David Pashley of Direct Insight, and today he's talking about CRA challenges for IoT devices. For those watching live, if you have any questions, comments, or observations for either Mustanir or for David Pashley, then please put them in Zoom chat, and we'll be having a Q&A shortly. David, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you very much, Chris.